If there was one thing Fletcher Hayes had learned in his 32 years of rambling through life, it was that nothing, absolutely nothing, ever went according to plan. So when he agreed to be a guest instructor at the Intergalactic Academy of Cultural Exchange, he figured the worst that could happen was a few awkward misunderstandings about Earth customs. Maybe a mishap with utensils or a botched handshake. He hadn't planned on bleeding all over a classroom full of alien students. The lecture hall buzzed with a low, humming excitement. The students, a rainbow assortment of scales, fur, and bioluminescent patches huddled together in groups, whispering and pointing at Fletcher. He adjusted the stiff collar of his borrowed academy uniform, feeling sweat bead under his arms. Professor Tyven, a spindly, blue-skinned being with 4 eyes and a permanent look of mild concern, floated to the center of the room and raised one hand. "Students," Tyven said, voice metallic yet oddly soothing, "today we are honored with a representative from Terra known locally as Earth. Please welcome Fletcher Hayes." Polite clapping followed. A few students gave small cheers, though Fletcher suspected it had more to do with the novelty of seeing a human in person than any genuine excitement. Fletcher grinned and stepped forward. "Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me." He set down the bulky demonstration kit he had lugged all the way from Earth, flipping open the latches with a satisfying snap. Inside were various Earth artifacts: a football, a harmonica, a battered paperback of Tom Sawyer, a cast iron skillet, and because Tyven had suggested something culturally significant, a replica longsword. "Today," Fletcher said, hoisting the longsword in one hand, "I'm going to show you a little about Earth's old combat traditions. This weapon here is a sword specifically, a European longsword from the Middle Ages." A few students leaned forward, their eyes wide. One, a thick-set creature with a chest like a boulder, raised a hand. "Is it deadly?" the student asked, his voice rumbling like shifting rocks. Fletcher chuckled. "Well, yeah, it was designed to be, but don't worry, this one's a replica blunt-edged." He gave the blade a showy twirl. Unfortunately, the ceiling in the Academy's halls was lower than he had anticipated. The tip of the sword clipped a hanging light fixture, sending shards of glass raining down. Instinctively, Fletcher jerked back and the blade caught the inside of his forearm. There was a sharp sting, then warmth. Fletcher looked down and saw blood blooming bright and fast along his sleeve. For a moment, the room froze. Every alien eye locked on him. Gasps rippled through the hall. One student let out a high-pitched shriek and ducked under his desk. Another clutched his own upper limb as if he could feel the injury by proxy. Fletcher pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the blood leak between his fingers. His heart pounded, but he forced a shaky grin. "It's only a flesh wound," he said. No one laughed. In fact, several students looked ready to faint. Professor Tyven floated closer, peering at Fletcher with all 4 eyes wide. "You are leaking. Should we summon emergency medical intervention?" Fletcher shook his head, already regretting the motion as dizziness tugged at him. "Nah, it's just a cut. I can take care of it." He reached into his kit, pulling out a crumpled bandana. As he tied it tightly around his arm, he noticed the students whispering again, their faces or the alien equivalents a mixture of awe and horror. One student, a small bird-like creature with feathers that shifted color with its emotions, raised a trembling wing. "You are still conscious?" "Yeah," Fletcher said, wincing as he tightened the makeshift bandage. "It hurts, but it's not the end of the world." Tyven buzzed nervously. "Perhaps we should adjourn. Immediate rest and sanitization are recommended." Fletcher nodded, feeling sweat break out across his brow. "Good idea." He started gathering his things, but the room tilted alarmingly. His legs buckled. Before he could hit the ground, 2 of the larger students rushed forward, catching him awkwardly between them. "Careful," Fletcher muttered, his voice slurring slightly. "I'm heavier than I look." One of the students, a green, rubbery being named Velrix, looked down at him with clear confusion. "You are damaged beyond normal operational parameters. Yet you jest," Fletcher tried to shrug, but it turned into more of a twitch. Comes with the territory. Tyven directed the students to carry Fletcher to the Academy's infirmary, which was a sleek, sterile place smelling of antiseptic and something faintly floral. A medical drone zipped over, scanning Fletcher with a beam of blue light. Foreign biological sample detected, the drone chirped. He's human, Tyven said quickly. Terrestrial mammalian biology. The drone whirred and adjusted its instruments. Laceration depth 3 centimeters. Blood loss, moderate, risk of infection, high. Sounds about right, Fletcher mumbled. A soft bed materialized from the wall and the students gently laid him down. The drone began cleaning the wound with a cold, stinging solution. Fletcher gritted his teeth. You are in pain, Velrix asked, hovering nearby. Yeah. Doesn't mean it's the end of the line, Fletcher said through clenched teeth. How much structural damage can a human sustain and survive? One of the students asked, his voice filled with horrified fascination. Fletcher closed his eyes, trying to marshal his wits. Depends. A cut like this, no big deal. Broken bones, organs getting hit, that's serious. Takes time to heal. The students huddled closer, scribbling notes furiously. You heal naturally, Velrix asked. No regeneration tanks, no molecular reknitting, Fletcher cracked one eye open. Nope. Just time, rest, and medical care. Human bodies are stubborn. The drone finished sealing the wound with a patch that cooled Fletcher's skin to near frostbite levels. He shivered. Treatment complete. Patient requires rest and nutrient intake, the drone said. Tyven floated closer. You must remain here until sufficiently recovered. Fletcher nodded weakly. Yeah, probably a good idea. The students lingered for a moment longer, staring at him with a mixture of reverence and horror. Finally, Tyven herded them out with gentle prodding. As the door hissed shut, Fletcher slumped against the bed. Welcome to the Intergalactic Academy, he muttered. 2 days later, Fletcher was back on his feet, though the infirmary staff insisted he use a sling to keep from reopening the wound. He hated the sling, it made him feel helpless, but he understood the necessity. Tyven met him outside the infirmary, floating in that perpetually worried way of his. Are you certain you are prepared to resume instruction? Tyven asked. Yeah, Fletcher said. Just. Maybe no sword demonstrations for a while. Tyven's mouth twitched in what Fletcher had learned was the Academy's version of a smile. When Fletcher returned to the classroom, the reaction was immediate. Students gasped, whispered, and stared at his sling like it was a medal of honor. Velrix approached cautiously. You have survived, Fletcher laughed, though it hurt his side to do so. Told you, only a flesh wound. The rest of the day was spent discussing human medical practices, first aid, and the concept of grit, something the students found simultaneously inspiring and utterly bewildering. When the session ended, one of the students, a lanky creature with translucent skin, raised a hand. May we witness another demonstration of human resilience? Fletcher blinked. What, you want me to hurt myself again? The students looked genuinely torn between fascination and guilt. No, Velrix said quickly, but perhaps a controlled challenge, Fletcher considered. All right. But nothing sharp this time. He glanced around the classroom, eyes landing on a stack of heavy Academy manuals. Let's do a strength test, he suggested. The students eagerly set up a challenge, lifting and carrying a stack of manuals across the room. Fletcher agreed, but insisted on doing it one-handed because of the sling. The task was grueling. Sweat poured down his face and his muscles screamed in protest. The students watched, breathless, as he staggered the last few feet and dumped the manuals onto a table. Collapsing into a chair, Fletcher wiped his brow. See, he panted. Humans, stubborn as hell, Velrix nodded solemnly. We are beginning to understand. Fletcher leaned back, exhausted but oddly satisfied. Maybe he wasn't the perfect ambassador for Earth. Maybe he was a little battered, a little broken. But in this strange new world, that made him exactly what they needed. The next morning, Fletcher found himself squinting under the Academy's twin suns, standing in the middle of what could only be described as an obstacle course designed by a committee that had read about Earth sports once, and decided to wing it. He shifted his sling awkwardly, eyeing the towering walls, uneven terrain patches, and what looked suspiciously like a shallow pit filled with wriggling metallic vines. A group of students clustered nearby, their excitement palpable even without understanding their languages fully. Velrix flapped a gelatinous limb toward the course. "We have constructed a trial of endurance in honor of your species' renowned stubbornness." Fletcher blew out a slow breath. "You built all this overnight," a smaller, insectoid student flicked its antennae proudly. "We condensed standard construction protocols. Efficiency is paramount." "Right," Fletcher muttered, adjusting the strap of his sling. "And you all expect me to run this thing?" Velrix's body shifted to a deep violet, a color Fletcher had learned meant eagerness. "Only if you are willing." "Observing your methods would be enlightening." The students shifted, murmuring among themselves in languages that clicked, hummed, and occasionally hooted. Fletcher rubbed his face with his good hand, debating the wisdom of pushing himself after nearly passing out 2 days ago. But the expectant faces staring at him made the decision for him. "All right," he said, rolling his shoulders. "But ground rules, no touching the vines, no climbing with the bad arm, and if I pass out again, someone better carry me to the infirmary." The students bobbed their heads or equivalent body parts in solemn agreement. Taking a running start, Fletcher charged toward the first obstacle, a slanted wall slick with some kind of bio-resin. He leapt, planted his foot, and scrambled upward, gripping with his good hand. His injured side ached fiercely, but he gritted his teeth and heaved himself over. A collective gasp rippled behind him. "You are operating at reduced equilibrium," a voice called out. "Yeah, thanks," Fletcher grunted without looking back. He dropped down the other side, landing harder than intended. His knees jolted painfully. Before he could catch his breath, he found himself facing a series of low hurdles, spaced just unevenly enough to trip someone not paying attention. He powered through them, hopping awkwardly, using momentum more than grace. His sling flapped wildly against his torso, and more than once he stumbled, but he kept moving. The pit of metallic vines loomed ahead, undulating lazily. Fletcher slowed, studying it. The writhing mass looked flexible but untrustworthy. A student from the sidelines shouted, "They are programmed to entangle." Fletcher laughed breathlessly. "Of course they are." He picked his way along the narrow beam stretched across the pit, balancing carefully. Halfway across, a vine snapped upward, brushing his ankle. He jerked instinctively, almost losing his footing, but managed to hop forward, reaching the far side with a thud. Cheers erupted behind him. Velrix floated closer as Fletcher bent over, hands on his knees, panting hard. "You exhibit remarkable determination," Velrix said, "even in a compromised state." Fletcher straightened slowly, sweat dripping down his temple. "That's humanity for you, stupid enough to keep going when smarter species would quit." The students buzzed with excitement, several jotting furious notes on their holographic slates. One of the taller students, a sinewy being whose joints bent in unsettling ways, approached cautiously. "May we inquire about your recovery cycle?" Fletcher wiped his forehead. "Normally. A cut like this would take a couple weeks to heal properly, maybe longer if you're unlucky." The student's eyes widened, the membranes around them pulsing faintly. "Weeks without technological assistance?" "Yep, body knits itself back together, slowly, painfully, sometimes badly." More frantic note-taking. Another student, this one resembling a walking coral reef, raised a cluster of tendrils. "What sustains you during this period of vulnerability?" Fletcher shrugged, wincing. "Rest, food, medicine if available, otherwise just stubbornness and bad television." Several students exchanged confused glances at the last part, but wisely chose not to follow up. Velrix tilted slightly. "Would you consent to a controlled observation session during your recovery?" Fletcher hesitated. "You mean, sit around while you all stare at me like a biology exhibit?" Velrix's skin flushed a hopeful yellow. "Correct." He sighed, scratching the back of his neck. Sure, why not? Not like I had plans. They herded him toward the academy's central courtyard, a wide space shaded by towering, crystalline trees that resonated softly in the breeze. A cushioned bench materialized from the ground, and Fletcher sank onto it gratefully. The students formed a loose semicircle around him, some perching on floating platforms, others crouching or coiling in ways that made Fletcher's joints ache just watching. One of them, a stocky being covered in interlocking plates, leaned forward. Describe emotional state during injury. Fletcher rubbed his chin thoughtfully. At first, shock, then pain, then mostly annoyance. A ripple of confusion passed through the group. You did not experience existential dread at the breach of bodily integrity? Velrix asked. Fletcher laughed hoarsely. Nah, humans are used to getting banged up. Paper cuts, stubbed toes, falling off bikes. You get desensitized. The coral-like student waved a tendril. Clarify, paper cut. Fletcher chuckled. Imagine an injury so tiny it's almost invisible, but it hurts like you've been stabbed by 1,000 needles. The students recoiled collectively. One of the insectoid beings buzzed. Terrestrial life seems unnecessarily hazardous. You're not wrong, Fletcher said, stretching out his legs. Earth tries to kill you every day, whether animals, disease, gravity. You get tough or you don't make it. Silence settled over the courtyard, broken only by the soft hum of the crystalline trees. Velrix floated closer. And yet you thrive. Fletcher leaned back, squinting up at the shifting sky. We're too stubborn to do otherwise. Hours passed, marked by the slow, lazy swing of the suns overhead. The students took turns asking increasingly bizarre questions. Did humans regrow limbs? No. Could humans survive in vacuum? Definitely not. Was emotional trauma considered an acceptable cost for physical resilience? Depends who you ask. By late afternoon, Fletcher's stomach growled loudly enough that several students flinched. Velrix tilted his head. You require sustenance. Badly, Fletcher said, standing up with a groan. Preferably something edible by human standards. A short time later, they gathered in the academy's dining hall, a cavernous chamber filled with the smells of 100 different cuisines, most of them utterly incomprehensible to Fletcher's nose. A section labeled Terrestrial Safe glowed comfortingly in one corner. Fletcher loaded a tray with simple fare. Bread like rolls, protein cubes that tasted vaguely of chicken, and a thick green soup that smelled like spinach and regret. Velrix selected a shimmering plate of translucent slivers that quivered when touched. Other students gathered with dishes that hissed, steamed, or occasionally pulsed in unsettling ways. As they ate, conversation turned to Earth's less obvious dangers. Explain infection, asked the plated student, cautiously poking a protein cube. Fletcher chewed thoughtfully before answering. When a wound gets dirty, bacteria, tiny living things invisible to the eye, can get inside. If your body doesn't fight them off, they can make you very sick. Sometimes even kill you. Several students dropped their utensils. Velrix's color shifted to a pale green. Your species combats invisible predators, internally. Yup, Fletcher said around a mouthful of bread. Our immune systems are like tiny soldiers. Most of the time they win, sometimes not. The coral-like student shivered, scattering tiny bits of debris onto the table. Existence on your planet sounds harrowing. You get used to it, Fletcher said with a shrug. Or you don't. After the meal, they returned to the courtyard, where twilight painted the crystalline trees in hues of molten gold and deep indigo. Fletcher felt bone-tired, but oddly peaceful. Velrix floated closer again. Would you consider participating in an extended study of human resilience? Fletcher laughed softly. Sure, as long as it doesn't involve more bleeding. Velrix's skin shimmered a grateful silver. Agreement recorded. As evening deepened, Fletcher leaned back on the cushioned bench, watching the stars emerge one by one, scattered across the alien sky. Maybe he hadn't planned on becoming a living exhibit. Maybe he hadn't planned on much of anything. But if the galaxy wanted to study stubbornness, they had definitely found the right human. The courtyard's crystalline trees still whispered in the warm breeze when Fletcher returned the next day, sling awkwardly adjusted, a thin scar peeking under the edge of his sleeve. The students were already waiting, gathered around a strange contraption that hadn't been there yesterday. It looked suspiciously like a treadmill had collided with a hamster wheel and lost. Velrix hovered near it, his gelatinous form shifting with nervous anticipation. "We have devised a test for human cardiovascular tenacity." Fletcher eyed the machine warily. "Looks like you built a medieval torture device." A thin, insectoid student with a shimmering carapace twitched its antennae. "It simulates fluctuating terrain and atmospheric conditions found on various worlds." "Great," Fletcher muttered, because walking on regular ground wasn't hard enough. Velrix gestured toward the machine. "You may terminate the exercise at any point should biological failure seem imminent." "Comforting," Fletcher said dryly. The students gathered closer, slates ready, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Fletcher flexed his legs and stepped onto the platform. It gave a slight mechanical groan under his weight. The machine whirred to life with a soft chime. At first, it wasn't bad. Just a gentle incline, the kind he might have jogged up during high school track practice. His legs moved smoothly. The sling kept his injured arm from bouncing too much. He settled into a rhythm, feeling the familiar burn build in his thighs. Then the incline snapped to a steep slope without warning. The platform bucked slightly, mimicking uneven ground. Fletcher stumbled but caught himself, planting his feet wide. "You are compensating for destabilization with lower limb flexion," Velrix observed, scribbling notes furiously. "That's called not wanting to faceplant," Fletcher puffed. The air grew thicker, a subtle shift he only noticed when his lungs began working harder. He coughed once, then found a steady breathing pattern. The students watched, fascinated. "Atmospheric density increased by 20%, the insectoid student announced. Fletcher pushed through it, teeth gritted. Sweat dripped into his eyes, blurring the edges of the courtyard. His injured side throbbed, but he ignored it. The machine jerked again, tilting sideways. Fletcher twisted his torso to stay upright. Pain lanced through his shoulder, sharp and immediate. He cursed under his breath but kept moving. "You are experiencing musculoskeletal strain." Velrix called out, alarmed. "No kidding," Fletcher gasped. The treadmill finally slowed, the incline easing. Fletcher stumbled off, collapsing onto a nearby bench. His chest heaved, his shirt plastered to his skin. Velrix floated closer, extending a tendril-like sensor. "May we assess your vital functions?" Fletcher waved him off. "Still breathing, heart's pounding, otherwise fine." The students buzzed, exchanging rapid notes. A choral-like student leaned forward. "You engaged in intense exertion without prior full recovery. Risk assessment." "High," Fletcher admitted, grinning crookedly. "But manageable if you know your limits." Several students looked horrified. "You gambled biological integrity for demonstration purposes," one asked, voice quivering. Fletcher shrugged with his good shoulder. "Sometimes you have to push to see what you're made of." Velrix's body shifted to a deep blue, a color Fletcher hadn't seen before. "Your species actively balances self-preservation against experiential gain." "You could say that," Fletcher said, grabbing a towel from a nearby dispenser and wiping his face. "Sometimes we bet wrong. Sometimes we find out we're tougher than we thought." The insectoid student tilted its head. "What occurs when the wager is lost?" Fletcher tossed the towel aside. "You heal. Or you don't. Either way, you learn something." The courtyard fell silent for a few moments, the crystalline trees humming softly in the background. Finally, Velrix floated closer. "We wish to understand human healing kinetics further. Would you consent to a biopsy?" Fletcher blinked. "You want to take a chunk out of me now?" Velrix's skin flushed apologetically. "A minimally invasive extraction, localized tissue sampling." Fletcher considered. His arm still ached from the treadmill ordeal, and the idea of letting aliens poke him with sharp instruments wasn't exactly appealing. But curiosity tugged at him too. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeve carefully. but you better have something to numb it. The coral-like student produced a sleek device that emitted a low hum. Fletcher flinched when it touched his skin, but the area quickly went numb. He watched with detached interest as a tiny, almost invisible blade made a shallow incision, extracting a sliver of tissue. The students leaned in, fascinated. The coral student deposited the sample into a small container that sealed itself with a hiss. Fletcher looked down at the fresh cut. It was no bigger than a paper cut, but already oozing a thin line of blood. He pressed a sterile patch over it without waiting for instruction. "Simple first aid," he said. "Pressure stops the bleeding, keep it clean. Body does the rest." Velrix floated back slightly, processing. "You rely primarily on autonomous regeneration." "Yeah, our bodies are pretty good at patching themselves up. Slow but reliable." The insectoid student buzzed thoughtfully. "Injury seems a fundamental aspect of human existence." "You're not wrong," Fletcher said, flexing his fingers to make sure the numbness was wearing off. "We get hurt, we heal, we move on." Velrix shifted color again, this time to a muted gold. "Resilience appears to be your defining characteristic." Fletcher leaned back, resting his head against the cool surface of the bench. "Maybe, or maybe we're just too stubborn to know when to quit." The students murmured among themselves, the sounds blending into the evening breeze. Fletcher let it wash over him, too tired to care. Hours later, the suns dipped below the horizon, staining the sky with deep purples and fiery reds. The academy's soft courtyard lights blinked on, casting long shadows across the strange trees. Velrix returned, hovering quietly. "We have compiled preliminary findings," he said. "Your physiological responses exceed projections." Fletcher cracked one eye open. "So I'm not a complete wreck. Your biological systems exhibit high thresholds for trauma endurance and recovery efficiency," Velrix said, "in spite of apparent fragility." Fletcher chuckled, low and rough. "That's humans for you. Break easy, heal stubborn." Velrix hovered closer, his form shifting colors slowly. "We have gained much knowledge from your participation. Your willingness was unexpected." Fletcher shrugged again, careful not to jostle his still healing shoulder. "You asked." "I figured, why not?" The coral-like student approached, setting a small container beside him. Inside was a nutrient gel, tailored for terrestrial biology. "For recovery," the student said, voice almost reverent. Fletcher picked it up, sniffed it cautiously, and took a tentative sip. It tasted vaguely of vanilla and something he couldn't quite place, but it wasn't terrible. He drained it and wiped his mouth. "Thanks," he said. Velrix's body rippled once more. "We will recommend an observational period of complete rest to optimize tissue regeneration." "Music to my ears," Fletcher said, standing slowly. His legs protested, but he stayed upright. "Lead the way." They guided him to a small, private recovery chamber nestled behind the courtyard. The walls shimmered with soft light, and a low hum vibrated through the floor, calming and steady. Fletcher collapsed onto the bed that rose from the floor, sighing deeply. Velrix lingered at the doorway. "You have exceeded expectations," Fletcher grinned, eyes already drifting closed. "Get used to it. Humans are full of surprises." The door slid shut with a gentle hiss, leaving Fletcher to the comforting warmth of the room and the steady thrum of his stubborn, recovering heart. Outside, under the whispering crystalline trees, the alien students recorded their final notes, their voices low and awed. The human had bled, stumbled, and strained, but in the end, he had simply kept going, baffling them all with the quiet, relentless miracle of being human.